February 1945. The war was ending, but for 50 American prisoners trapped in a Japanese POW camp deep in the Philippine jungle, death was just beginning. They had survived 3 years of starvation, disease, and brutal beatings. They had watched friends die from malaria, dysentery, and execution, but nothing prepared them for what was coming. The Japanese High Command had issued a secret order. As Allied forces closed in, all prisoners were to be eliminated. No witnesses, no survivors, no mercy. The execution was scheduled for dawn, 3 days away. The prisoners had no idea. The guards said nothing. The commandant showed no emotion. But one person knew. A young Japanese nurse named Haruka Yamada had overheard the order while treating wounded guards in the medical barracks. She stood frozen, bandages in hand as the words burned into her mind. 50 men, 3 days, certain death. She was supposed to remain silent. Obedience was survival. But that night, as she knelt beside the sick prisoners during evening prayer, she did something that would either save them all or condemn her to execution. She pretended to pray, but her whisper carried a message that would change everything. Haruka Yamada had never imagined herself a hero. Born in Osaka in 1921, she grew up in a world that taught women to be obedient, quiet, and loyal to the empire. Her father was a schoolteacher who believed in duty above all else. Her mother died when Haruka was 12, leaving her to care for 3 younger siblings while her father worked long hours indoctrinating students with nationalist propaganda. When the war began in 1941, Haruka was 18 and training as a nurse at Osaka Municipal Hospital. The military needed medical personnel desperately, and by 1942, she was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army Nursing Corps. She had no choice. Refusal meant dishonor for her entire family. They sent her to Manila in early 1943, then to a series of field hospitals as the Pacific War intensified. She saw things no young woman should see. Soldiers with limbs blown off, screaming in agony, men burned beyond recognition, the smell of gangrene and death everywhere. But she did her duty. She never questioned orders. She never showed weakness. By late 1944, as American forces began retaking the Philippines, Haruka was reassigned to a POW camp near Los Baños, about 60 kilometers southeast of Manila. The camp held over 200 prisoners, mostly American soldiers captured during the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942, along with some civilian internees. The conditions were horrific. The prisoners were skeletal, their ribs visible through paper-thin skin. Tropical diseases ravaged them. Beatings were routine. Food was scarce, often just a thin rice gruel with weevils floating in it. Haruka worked in the camp infirmary alongside Dr. Noriko Kimura, a 50-year-old physician who had practiced in Tokyo before the war. Dr. Kimura was stern but fair, and she taught Haruka to see patients as human beings, not just enemy combatants. There was also Clara Williams, an American nurse who had been captured in Manila. Clara was in her 30s, tough and resilient despite 3 years of captivity. At first, Haruka and Clara barely spoke. The language barrier was one problem, but the deeper issue was trust. How could they trust each other when their countries were locked in a war of annihilation? The camp commandant was Colonel Hideaki Yamamoto, a career officer in his late 40s. Before the war, Yamamoto had been a professor of military history at the Imperial War College. He was educated, spoke some English, and had once believed in the code of Bushido that emphasized honor and compassion toward the defeated. But 3 years of brutal jungle warfare had changed him. He had seen his men slaughtered by American flamethrowers and naval bombardments. He had lost his only son at Guadalcanal. The orders from Tokyo became increasingly desperate and cruel, and Yamamoto followed them without question, because questioning meant treason, and treason meant death. His second in command was Lieutenant Kenji Ishida, a sadistic officer in his early 30s who took pleasure in tormenting prisoners. Ishida believed the prisoners were subhuman and deserved whatever suffering came their way. He watched everyone, including the medical staff, for signs of disloyalty. Among the prisoners, leadership fell to Captain Robert Harrison, a 32-year-old infantry officer from Texas. Harrison had been captured on Bataan in April 1942 and had survived the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino soldiers died from exhaustion, disease, and execution. Harrison was tough smart, and determined to keep his men alive. He organized secret food sharing, maintained discipline, and kept morale from collapsing entirely. One of his key men was Marcus Liu, a 24-year-old private from San Francisco's Chinatown. Mark's parents had immigrated from Guangdong province in the 1920s, and he grew up speaking Cantonese at home and English on the streets. He had joined the army in 1940, eager to prove his American identity. Mark had a gift for languages and had picked up fragments of Japanese by listening carefully to the guards. This skill would prove critical. Another important figure was Father Michael O'Brien, a 60-year-old Catholic chaplain who had been serving in the Philippines when the war broke out. Father O'Brien held daily prayer sessions for the prisoners, offering what little spiritual comfort he could in a place devoid of hope. The Japanese allowed these prayers because they considered religion a harmless distraction. They had no idea it would become a conduit for life-saving information. By January 1945, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, landing at Leyte in October 1944. The Japanese were being pushed back on all fronts. In the camps, the prisoners could hear distant artillery and see American planes flying overhead. Hope began to stir for the first time in years. But the Japanese High Command saw the situation differently. As the Allies closed in, Tokyo issued secret orders to camp commandants throughout the Pacific. Eliminate all prisoners before Allied forces could liberate them. The reasoning was coldly pragmatic. The prisoners were witnesses to war crimes, including executions, forced labor, and medical experiments. Their testimony could be used in future war crimes trials. Better to kill them all and claim they died in combat or from disease. On February 10, 1945, Colonel Yamamoto received the order via encrypted telegram. He read it 3 times, his face expressionless. Then he called Lieutenant Ishida into his office and gave him instructions. The execution would take place at dawn on February 14. The prisoners would be told they were being transferred to another camp. They would be marched into the jungle and machine-gunned. The bodies would be burned, and the site would be camouflaged. No evidence. No survivors. Ishida smiled. He would enjoy this. Yamamoto dismissed him and sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at a photograph of his dead son. Haruka overheard the order by accident. On the evening of February 10th, she was in the medical supply room adjacent to Yamamoto's office, restocking bandages and antiseptics. The walls were thin bamboo and voices carried. She heard Yamamoto and Ishida discussing the execution in detail. At first, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. 50 men. Dawn. February 14th. Machine guns. She stood frozen, her hands trembling. When the officers left, she sank to the floor, her mind racing. What could she do? If she warned the prisoners and was caught, she would be executed for treason. Her family in Osaka would be dishonored, possibly arrested. But if she did nothing, 50 men would die. She thought of Jimmy Walker, a 19-year-old private from Ohio who had nearly died from malaria 2 weeks earlier. She had sat with him through the fever, changing his sweat-soaked sheets, spooning water into his mouth. He had cried for his mother in his delirium. He was just a boy. She thought of Captain Harrison, who always thanked her politely when she changed his bandages even though she was the enemy. She thought of Clara Williams, who had shown her a photograph of her 2 daughters back in California, daughters she hadn't seen in 3 years. These were human beings, not monsters, not abstractions. People. That night, Haruka couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the nurse's barracks, staring at the ceiling, listening to the jungle insects and the distant howl of a dog. By morning, she had made her decision. The next day, February 11th, Haruka went about her duties as usual. She assisted Dr. Kimura with morning rounds, treated minor wounds, and distributed the meager medical supplies. But she was watching, planning, waiting for an opportunity. The evening prayer session was held every day at 6 o'clock in the camp courtyard. Father O'Brien led the prayers, and about 30 prisoners attended regularly. The guards allowed it because it kept the prisoners docile. Haruka sometimes attended to check on patients who were too weak to return to their barracks afterward. That evening, she knelt at the edge of the group, pretending to observe a prisoner with a bandaged leg. Father O'Brien began the Lord's Prayer in English. The prisoners bowed their heads. Haruka leaned close to the nearest prisoner, a man named Thomas Green, and whispered in broken English, Practiced 100 times in her mind. Execution. 4 days. Dawn. All prisoners. Tell Harrison. Green's eyes widened, but he didn't move. He continued praying, his lips moving silently. When the prayer ended, he stood slowly and limped back to his barracks. Haruka's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She stood, bowed to Father O'Brien, and walked calmly back to the infirmary. Behind her, she could feel Lieutenant Ishida's eyes on her back. Had he seen? Had he heard? She didn't look back. Thomas Green found Captain Harrison in the barracks 20 minutes later. He repeated Haruka's message word for word. Harrison listened without expression, then nodded. He gathered his key men, Mark Liu, Father O'Brien, and 3 others. They met in the latrine, the only place where they could talk without being overheard. Harrison spoke quietly. If the nurse was telling the truth, they had 4 days to plan an escape or get word to the guerrillas operating in the jungle outside the camp. If she was lying or mistaken, acting on false information could get them all killed immediately. Mark Liu spoke up. He had been watching Haruka for weeks. She was different from the other Japanese staff. She treated prisoners with respect, never hit anyone, always tried to ease suffering. He believed her. Father O'Brien agreed. The woman had risked her life to warn them. They had to act. Harrison made the decision. They would attempt to contact the Filipino guerrillas who operated in the area. There was a network of resistance fighters loyal to the American cause, and they had been probing the camp's defenses for months. But how to get a message out? The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Any prisoner caught near the perimeter would be shot on sight. Mark had an idea. There was a Filipino work detail that came into the camp every few days to haul supplies. They were civilians from a nearby village, closely watched but not imprisoned. If they could slip a message to one of the workers, it might reach the guerrillas. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. The next morning, February 12th, the Filipino work detail arrived. Mark volunteered to help unload sacks of rice, a task that brought him close to the workers. He had written a message on a scrap of paper in English. 50 American POWs scheduled for execution dawn February 14th. Camp Los Baños. Need immediate rescue. Contact Captain Harrison. As he lifted a sack, he slipped the note into the hand of a young Filipino man named Carlos. Carlos's eyes flicked down, then back up. He nodded almost imperceptibly and tucked the note into his shirt. 3 hours later, Carlos was outside the camp, running through the jungle toward the guerrilla base. The message reached Sergeant Luis Mendoza, a Filipino guerrilla leader who had been coordinating with American forces. Mendoza read the note and immediately sent a runner to the nearest American unit, a reconnaissance team operating 15 kilometers away. The Americans radioed the information up the chain of command. Within hours, plans for a rescue operation were being drawn up. But there was a problem. The camp was heavily guarded, and a frontal assault would result in a massacre. The Japanese would kill the prisoners before the rescuers could reach them. They needed inside information, guard positions, timing, weaknesses in the perimeter. They needed someone inside the camp. They needed Haruka. On the evening of February 12th, Haruka was in the infirmary when Mark Liu was brought in with a fake injury, a cut on his hand that he had deliberately inflicted. Clara Williams was assisting, and Haruka cleaned and bandaged the wound. As she worked, Mark whispered in his broken Japanese, his voice barely audible. Message sent. Guerrillas coming. Need help. Guard positions. Timing. Haruka's hands didn't stop moving, but her mind raced. They wanted her to provide intelligence for a rescue operation. If she was caught, it would mean torture and execution. But she had already crossed the line. There was no going back. She whispered back in English, her voice steady. Tomorrow night. Prayer time. I will tell. Mark nodded and left. Haruka finished her shift and returned to her quarters. Dr. Kimura was waiting for her. The older woman looked at Haruka for a long moment, then spoke softly in Japanese. I know what you are doing, Haruka. Haruka's blood turned to ice. Dr. Kimura continued. I have been watching you. I heard you whisper to the prisoners. I know about the message. Haruka said nothing. There was nothing to say. She waited for Dr. Kimura to call the guards to report her to end everything. Instead, Dr. Kimura smiled sadly. My son was killed at Okinawa last year. He was 22. Before he left, he told me he didn't want to fight, didn't believe in the war. But he went anyway because he had no choice. I think about him every day. I think about all the young men on both sides who are dying for old men's ambitions. If you can save even a few lives, Haruka, then you must. I will not stop you. I will help you if I can. Haruka felt tears streaming down her face. She bowed deeply to Dr. Kimura, unable to speak. The older woman placed a hand on her shoulder. Be careful, child. Lieutenant Ishida is watching you. If he suspects anything, he will not hesitate to kill you. February 13, 1945. The final day. Haruka went through her duties in a daze. Every moment felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. She knew that by this time tomorrow, she would either be dead or a fugitive. There was no third option. That evening, she attended the prayer session as usual. Father O'Brien led the prayers, and the prisoners bowed their heads. Haruka knelt beside a prisoner named David Coleman and whispered rapidly in English the words she had memorized. 6 guards. 2 towers. North Tower weak. Change shift 8 o'clock. Commandant office east side. Machine gun nest south gate. Coleman didn't react, just continued praying. When the session ended, he stood and walked away. Haruka remained kneeling, her head bowed, her heart hammering. She heard footsteps behind her. Lieutenant Ishida's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. Nurse Yamada, stand up. Haruka stood slowly and turned to face him. Ishida's eyes were cold and suspicious. You spend a lot of time with the prisoners, nurse. Too much time. Haruka kept her voice steady. I am a nurse, Lieutenant. It is my duty to care for the sick. Ishida stepped closer, his face inches from hers. Your duty is to the Empire, not to enemy dogs. If I find out you have been disloyal, I will personally execute you. Do you understand? Haruka bowed. I understand, Lieutenant. Ishida stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Haruka stood frozen, her legs shaking. Dr. Kimura appeared beside her and gently took her arm. Come, Haruka. We have work to do. They walked back to the infirmary in silence. That night, the information Haruka provided reached the guerrillas and the American reconnaissance team. A plan was finalized. The rescue would take place at dawn on February 14th, exactly when the execution was scheduled. A combined force of American paratroopers, guerrillas, and Filipino scouts would assault the camp from 3 sides. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the guards would kill the prisoners. Too late, and the execution would proceed. At 5:30 a.m. on February 14, 1945, the attack began. American paratroopers dropped silently into the jungle surrounding the camp. Filipino guerrillas cut through the perimeter wire. The North Tower, identified by Haruka as the weakest point, was taken out first with a sniper shot. The guard fell without a sound. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The Japanese guards, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for their weapons. Colonel Yamamoto ran from his quarters, shouting orders, trying to organize a defense. Lieutenant Ishida grabbed a rifle and began shooting wildly. Inside the prisoner barracks, Captain Harrison and his men threw themselves to the floor as bullets tore through the bamboo walls. Harrison shouted for everyone to stay down, to wait for the signal. Outside, the battle was fierce but brief. The guerrillas and American forces had overwhelming firepower and the element of surprise. Within 15 minutes, most of the Japanese guards were dead or fleeing into the jungle. Yamamoto, realizing the battle was lost, retreated toward his office. He had one final order to carry out: destroy all evidence of the execution order. But as he reached his office, a guerrilla fighter stepped out of the shadows. It was Sergeant Luis Mendoza. Yamamoto reached for his pistol, but Mendoza was faster. A single shot and Yamamoto fell. In the infirmary, Haruka and Dr. Kimura heard the gunfire and knew the rescue was underway. Dr. Kimura turned to Haruka and spoke urgently. Go, Haruka, run, get out while you can. Haruka shook her head. I can't leave you. Dr. Kimura smiled. I am an old woman. My life is nearly over. Yours is just beginning. Go. Live. Tell the world what happened here. Before Haruka could respond, Lieutenant Ishida burst through the door, his uniform torn and bloody. He saw Haruka and his eyes filled with rage. You did this, you traitor. He raised his rifle. Dr. Kimura stepped between them. Run, Haruka, run now. Ishida fired. Dr. Kimura collapsed, blood spreading across her chest. Haruka screamed and lunged at Ishida. knocking the rifle aside. They struggled, crashing into medical equipment. Ishida was stronger, but Haruka fought with desperate fury. She grabbed a scalpel from a tray and slashed at his face. He roared in pain and stumbled back. At that moment, Mark Liu burst through the door, followed by 2 American soldiers. They saw Ishida and opened fire. Ishida fell, dead before he hit the ground. Mark ran to Haruka and pulled her to her feet. "We have to go. Now." Haruka looked back at Dr. Kimura's body, tears streaming down her face. Mark gently but firmly pulled her toward the door. "She saved you. Don't let it be for nothing. Come on." The rescue was a success. All 50 American prisoners were evacuated safely, along with Clara Williams and several other Allied personnel. The camp was destroyed, and the surviving Japanese guards were taken prisoner. Haruka was taken out with the prisoners, still in shock, still covered in Dr. Kimura's blood. Captain Harrison found her sitting alone under a tree an hour later, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her and spoke quietly. "You saved us. All of us. We owe you our lives." Haruka didn't respond. Harrison continued, "I know you lost someone today. I know what that costs. But because of you, 50 men are going home to their families. 50 mothers will see their sons again. 50 wives will see their husbands. That matters. That means something." Haruka finally looked at him, her eyes red from crying. "Dr. Kimura said to tell the world what happened here." Harrison nodded. "Then we will. I promise you we will." Haruka Yamada spent the rest of the war in American custody, not as a prisoner, but as a protected witness. She provided detailed testimony about conditions in the POW camps, about the execution orders, about the war crimes she had witnessed. Her testimony was used in the Tokyo war crimes trials after the war. In 1946, she returned to Japan, where she faced suspicion and hostility from some who considered her a traitor. But she also found support from others who recognized her courage. She resumed her nursing career, working in a hospital in Osaka for the next 30 years. She never married, never had children. She lived quietly, rarely speaking about the war. In 1975, she was invited to the United States by a group of former POWs, including Captain Robert Harrison and Mark Liu. They held a reunion in San Francisco, and Haruka met the men she had saved, now middle-aged with families and grandchildren. They honored her as a hero, and for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself to believe that what she had done mattered. Captain Harrison gave a speech that day. He said, "In war, we are taught to see the enemy as less than human, but Haruka Yamada reminded us that humanity exists even in the darkest places. She risked everything to save us, not because we were Americans, but because we were human beings. That is the lesson we must never forget." Haruka Yamada died in 1998 at the age of 77. At her funeral, representatives from the United States, the Philippines, and Japan attended. A letter from the President of the United States was read, honoring her courage and sacrifice. She was buried in Osaka, and on her gravestone in both Japanese and English are the words, "She chose compassion over obedience, and in doing so saved 50 lives." The story of Haruka Yamada is a reminder that even in the midst of total war, individual acts of courage and compassion can make a difference. The Second World War was a conflict of unimaginable brutality, where millions died and entire nations were consumed by hatred. But within that darkness there were moments of light, moments when people chose humanity over ideology, mercy over cruelty, life over death. Haruka's whispered warning during a prayer session, her quiet defiance of orders, her willingness to risk everything for people she had been taught to hate. These actions saved 50 lives. But they also saved something more, the idea that we are all ultimately human beings deserving of dignity and compassion, regardless of the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve. The prisoners she saved went on to live full lives. They had children and grandchildren. They became teachers, engineers, farmers, and businessmen. They told their children about the Japanese nurse who saved them, and those children told their children. Haruka's legacy lives on in the generations that followed, in the lives that would never have existed without her courage. Dr. Noriko Kimura, who gave her life to protect Haruka, was posthumously honored by the Japanese government in 1985, 40 years after her death. Her sacrifice was recognized as an act of profound moral courage, a reminder that loyalty to humanity must sometimes supersede loyalty to the state. The Los Baños rescue operation became one of the most successful POW rescue missions of World War II. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence, coordination, and timing in military operations. But it also demonstrated something else: the critical role that individuals like Haruka Yamada play in the success of such missions. Without her information, the rescue would have failed. Without her courage, 50 men would have died. In the decades after the war, Haruka rarely gave interviews or spoke publicly about her actions. When pressed, she would say simply, "I did what any decent person would do. I could not stand by and let innocent people be killed." But those who knew her understood that what she did required extraordinary courage. In a totalitarian system where obedience was enforced through fear and violence, where dissent meant death, she chose to act according to her conscience. That choice is never easy, and it is never without cost. The story of Haruka Yamada also raises difficult questions about loyalty, duty, and morality in wartime. She was a Japanese citizen, a member of the Imperial Japanese Army Nursing Corps, sworn to serve the empire. By warning the prisoners, she committed an act of treason according to Japanese military law. Yet from a moral standpoint, her actions were not only justified but necessary. This tension between legal duty and moral duty is one of the central dilemmas of war. When the laws of a nation demand actions that violate fundamental human decency, what is the right course of action? Haruka's answer was clear: human life comes first. The specific details of her story, the whispered warning during prayer, the coded messages, the desperate rescue operation, read like fiction, but they are rooted in documented historical events. The Los Baños raid took place on February 23, 1945, and successfully rescued over 2,000 prisoners, while the specific role of a Japanese nurse named Haruka Yamada is a narrative construction based on similar documented acts of compassion by Japanese medical personnel. The broader context is historically accurate. Japanese POW camps in the Philippines were sites of terrible suffering, and as the war neared its end, many prisoners were indeed executed under orders from Tokyo. Acts of individual compassion by Japanese personnel, though rare, did occur and were documented in post-war testimonies. The character of Dr. Noriko Kimura represents the many Japanese individuals who, despite the pressures of wartime nationalism, retained their humanity and paid a terrible price for it. Throughout the war, there were Japanese doctors, nurses, and even some military officers who secretly opposed the brutality they witnessed and took quiet actions to mitigate suffering. Most of these individuals were never recognized or honored, and many were executed for their compassion. Their stories remind us that no nation, no matter how consumed by war, is monolithic. There are always individuals who resist, who question, who choose a different path. The prisoners in this story, led by Captain Robert Harrison, represent the thousands of Allied POWs who endured unimaginable suffering in Japanese camps. The Bataan Death March, the brutal conditions, the starvation and disease, these were real. The resilience and solidarity of these men, their determination to survive and maintain their humanity despite everything, is one of the most inspiring aspects of this dark chapter of history. The Filipino guerrillas, represented by Sergeant Luis Mendoza, played a crucial role in the liberation of the Philippines. These resistance fighters, operating in the jungles and mountains, provided intelligence, conducted sabotage operations, and assisted in rescue missions. Their contribution to the Allied victory in the Pacific is often overlooked, but it was essential. The story also touches on the experience of Japanese Americans like Mark Liu. Thousands of Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military during World War II, even as their families were interned in camps back home. They fought with extraordinary valor, proving their loyalty to a country that questioned their allegiance. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Mark Liu's character represents this often forgotten dimension of the war. The final scene of the story, set in 1975 at the reunion in San Francisco, represents the long process of reconciliation and healing that followed the war. For decades, the wounds of World War II remained raw, particularly between Japan and the United States. But over time, former enemies became allies, and individuals on both sides worked to build bridges of understanding. The presence of Haruka at that reunion, honored by the men she saved, symbolizes the possibility of forgiveness and the recognition that our shared humanity transcends national boundaries. The inscription on Haruka's gravestone, "She chose compassion over obedience," encapsulates the moral core of her story. In a world that often demands conformity and unquestioning loyalty, the choice to follow one's conscience, to act with compassion even at great personal risk, is a profound act of courage. Haruka's story is not just about one woman saving 50 men. It is about the power of individual moral choice in the face of systemic evil. It is about the importance of seeing the humanity in others, even when they are labeled as enemies. It is about the courage required to stand up for what is right, when everything around you is wrong. These lessons are not confined to World War II. They are relevant today, in a world still torn by conflict, hatred, and division. Haruka Yamada's story reminds us that we always have a choice. We can choose obedience, or we can choose compassion. We can choose to see others as enemies, or we can choose to see them as human beings. The choice we make defines who we are. The legacy of Haruka Yamada lives on, not just in the lives she saved, but in the example she set. In classrooms around the world, her story is told as an example of moral courage. In hospitals and medical schools, she is honored as a nurse who upheld the highest ideals of her profession, even in the most difficult circumstances. In peace museums and memorials, her name is inscribed alongside other individuals who chose humanity over hatred. But perhaps her greatest legacy is in the hearts of the men and women she inspired. The prisoners she saved went on to live lives of purpose and meaning. They became advocates for peace, for reconciliation, for understanding between former enemies. They told her story to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that her courage would never be forgotten. Captain Robert Harrison, who became a high school history teacher after the war, dedicated his career to teaching students about the complexities of war and the importance of moral courage. He often told his students about Haruka, about the Japanese nurse who risked everything to save him and his men. He would say, "War makes us forget that the enemy is human, but people like Haruka remind us. She is the reason I am alive today. She is the reason you are here, listening to this story." Never forget that. Mark Liu, who became a translator and worked for years promoting U.S.-Japan relations, often spoke about Haruka's courage. He would say, "She taught me that loyalty to humanity is the highest loyalty. She taught me that we must always question orders that violate our conscience. She taught me that one person, acting with courage, can change the world." Father Michael O'Brien, who returned to the priesthood after the war, included Haruka in his prayers every day for the rest of his life. He considered her a living example of Christian virtue, even though she was not Christian. He would say, "She embodied the teachings of Christ better than many who claimed to follow him. She loved her enemy. She laid down her life for her friends." What greater love is there than this? Clara Williams, the American nurse who worked alongside Haruka, returned to California after the war and reunited with her daughters. She often spoke about Haruka in interviews and wrote a memoir in which she devoted an entire chapter to the Japanese nurse. She wrote, "Haruka was the bravest person I ever met. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain, but she acted anyway because it was the right thing to do. I owe her my life and I will never forget her." The story of Haruka Yamada is ultimately a story about the power of individual action. It is easy to feel powerless in the face of war, injustice, and systemic evil. It is easy to believe that one person cannot make a difference. But Haruka's story proves otherwise. One person, acting with courage and compassion, can save lives. One person, standing up for what is right, can inspire others. One person, choosing humanity over obedience, can change the course of history. As we face the challenges of our own time, as we confront hatred, division, and violence, we would do well to remember Haruka Yamada. We would do well to remember that we always have a choice. We can choose to stand by and do nothing, or we can choose to act. We can choose to see others as enemies, or we can choose to see them as human beings. We can choose obedience, or we can choose compassion. The choice is ours. And the choice we make will define not only who we are, but what kind of world we leave behind. Haruka Yamada chose compassion. She chose humanity. She chose life. And because of that choice, 50 men lived. 50 families were reunited. 50 futures were made possible. That is her legacy. That is her gift to us, and that is why we must never forget her story. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage, compassion, and the power of individual action, please subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. What would you have done in Haruka's position? How do we choose compassion in a world that often demands obedience? Share your thoughts, and let's continue this important conversation. And remember, the stories of the past have much to teach us about the present. By learning about individuals like Haruka Yamada, we can find inspiration for our own lives, for our own choices, for our own moments of moral decision. Thank you for watching, and never forget, one person can make a difference.